My name is Donovan Kellerman. 7 days ago, I was a bank manager in Columbus, Ohio. Then Yellowstone erupted and turned our world into a frozen wasteland. While everyone else panicked, I realized something crucial. I had access to every vault, in the city, and in an Ice Age apocalypse, that made me either the most valuable man alive or the biggest target for desperate survivors who wanted what I knew. This is how I survived the first week when civilization collapsed and temperature dropped 40 degrees in 4 days. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Donovan Kellerman, but everyone at First National Trust called me Dutch. 7 days ago, I was pulling down a 6-figure salary as a regional bank manager in Columbus, Ohio. I had a corner office on the 32nd floor, a German sedan in the parking garage, and the kind of life where my biggest worry was quarterly earnings reports. Today, I'm the reason 37 people are still breathing in a world that's trying to freeze us all to death. You're probably wondering how a guy who spent 15 years shuffling paperwork and approving loans became the leader of a post-apocalyptic survivor group. Trust me, a week ago I would have laughed at that idea too. But when civilization collapses in less than 48 hours, you discover things about yourself that no corporate training manual ever prepared you for. I need to tell you this story, because if you're watching this, you might be facing your own apocalypse someday. And I want you to understand something important. Your old skills aren't useless when the world ends. You just need to figure out how to use them to keep people alive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the morning when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was doing what I'd done every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. I arrived at the bank at exactly 7:30, took the elevator to the 32nd floor, and settled into my corner office with a cup of coffee and the previous day's transaction reports. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Check overnight deposits, review loan applications, prepare for the 9 o'clock executive meeting. Simple, organized, efficient. I had the morning news playing on the wall-mounted television, mostly as background noise while I worked. The anchor was talking about something geological, scientists discussing elevated seismic activity in Yellowstone National Park. I remember thinking it was the kind of story that would disappear from the news cycle in a day or two, just another scientific warning that never amounts to anything serious. The irony isn't lost on me now. I spent my entire career analyzing risk, calculating probabilities, assessing potential losses. But when real catastrophic risk was being broadcast right in front of me, I dismissed it as easily as I'd dismiss a loan application from someone with bad credit. I was more concerned about our elevated loan default rates than I was about Yellowstone's elevated seismic activity. Patricia Williams had been my executive assistant for 12 years. In all that time, she had never once entered my office without knocking. She was the kind of person who scheduled meetings for scheduling meetings, who sent calendar invitations 3 days in advance for 5-minute conversations. So when she burst through my door that morning without any warning, I knew something was seriously wrong. Her face was completely white and her hands were shaking as she pointed at the television. She couldn't even form complete sentences at first. Just kept saying, "Mr. Kellerman, you need to see this," over and over again. I turned up the volume and felt my stomach drop to somewhere around my shoes. The news anchor looked like he'd seen the end of the world, which, as it turned out, he had. Behind him was a live feed from somewhere out west that showed what looked like a nuclear explosion, except this mushroom cloud was gray-black and spreading across the entire horizon like spilled ink. It was massive. Bigger than anything I'd ever seen in any disaster movie. The Yellowstone caldera has experienced a catastrophic eruption, the anchor was saying, and his voice had that hollow quality that people get when they're delivering news they can't quite believe themselves. Initial reports indicate this is a supervolcanic event. The ash cloud is already visible from Denver and is expected to reach the East Coast within 48 hours. I loosened my tie, which was something I only did during really stressful situations. The last time I'd done it was during the 2008 financial crisis, when we thought the entire banking system might collapse. But that crisis had been about numbers, on spreadsheets and theoretical economic models. This was something else entirely. Patricia was still standing in my doorway, and I could see other employees gathering in the hallway behind her. Everyone was looking at me like I was supposed to have answers, like being a bank manager somehow qualified me to deal with volcanic eruptions. I did what any corporate executive would do in a crisis situation. I started implementing protocols. "Patricia, call the district office immediately," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. "We need to implement emergency procedures. Contact all department heads and tell them to report to the conference room in 15 minutes. But even as I was giving these instructions, I knew our emergency protocols were designed for things like bank robberies, power outages, and computer system failures. We had procedures for dealing with disgruntled customers and suspicious financial transactions. Nobody had ever written a protocol for dealing with the end of civilization as we know it. The executive meeting that morning was surreal. I sat at the head of our mahogany conference table surrounded by 6 other managers, all of us trying to pretend this was just another business crisis we could solve with proper planning and resource allocation. We talked about maintaining normal operations, reassuring customers, coordinating with other branches, all the usual corporate responses to unusual situations. But outside the conference room windows, I could see people starting to panic. The parking lot was filling up with cars as people rushed to the bank to withdraw cash. The ATM line was already stretching around the building. And in the distance, I could see the first traces of ash beginning to fall like gray snow. By noon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. That might not sound like much, but in March, in Ohio, 15 degrees is the difference between spring weather and winter weather, and this was just the beginning. The ash cloud was blocking sunlight across half the continent, and every weather report was predicting much worse to come. The bank lobby was chaos. Every customer wanted to withdraw their entire account balance, as if paper money was going to be worth anything when trucks stopped delivering food to grocery stores. I watched from my office window as the crowd grew larger and more desperate. People were shouting, pushing, fighting over places in line. These were our regular customers, people I'd known for years, and they were turning into something I didn't recognize. Patricia came to my office around 2 o'clock to tell me she was leaving early to pick up her son from school and stock up on supplies. Most of the other employees had already left or were planning to leave soon. I told her to go ahead. That family came first. But the truth was, I didn't have anyone to go home to. My ex-wife Linda used to say I was married to my job, and she wasn't wrong. After our divorce 3 years ago, I'd thrown myself even deeper into work. I lived alone in a downtown condo, had no kids, no pets, no real hobbies outside of banking. My social life consisted of business dinners and professional networking events. I'd built my entire identity around being successful at managing other people's money. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I had a choice to make. I could try to drive home to my condo, assuming the roads weren't completely blocked with abandoned cars and panicking people, or I could stay at the bank, which was starting to look like one of the safest buildings in the city. It was designed to be secure, it had backup power systems, and it contained resources that might be valuable in whatever was coming next. The decision was made for me around 5 o'clock when I looked out the window and saw the roads were completely impassable. Cars were abandoned everywhere, some still running with their doors open where people had just given up and started walking. The ash was falling heavier now, coating everything in a gray blanket that made the whole city look like a black and white photograph. I spent that first night in the bank vault, surrounded by stacks of money that had become completely worthless in the span of a single day. It was warm down there, insulated from the dropping temperatures outside. But more than that, it felt safe in a way that my downtown condo never could. The vault was designed to keep people out, but it was also keeping me in, protected from whatever was happening on the streets. I took inventory of our immediate resources that first night. The employee break room had a small refrigerator with some leftover lunches, a coffee maker, and a few boxes of crackers and cookies that people kept for afternoon snacks. There were 3 vending machines on our floor, fully stocked with sodas and snack foods. The building had its own water system and backup generators that could run essential systems for several days. It wasn't much, but it was more than most people had access to. And I was starting to realize that, in this new world, access to resources was going to be everything. I'd spent my career managing assets worth millions of dollars, but I'd never thought about the physical infrastructure that made modern life possible. Now I was learning fast. I didn't sleep much that first night. The vault was quiet, but outside I could hear sirens, shouting, and the occasional sound of breaking glass. The city was tearing itself apart, and I was sitting in the middle of it all like some kind of corporate Robinson Crusoe. By morning, everything had changed. When I took the elevator back up to my office on the 32nd floor, I could barely see across the street. The ash cloud had completely blocked out the sun, turning day into a kind of gray twilight that hurt your eyes to look at. The temperature had dropped another 20 degrees overnight, and I could see my breath when I breathed. On the windows, the view from my office showed me a city I didn't recognize. Cars were buried under ash and abandoned everywhere. Some buildings had broken windows where people had tried to break in looking for supplies or shelter. There were groups of people moving through the streets, but they were bundled up like it was the middle of winter, and they moved with the kind of urgency that suggested they were running from something or toward something equally desperate. The radio reports were sporadic and mostly useless. Emergency broadcast systems kept repeating the same basic information. Stay indoors, conserve food and water, wait for further instructions. But it was becoming clear that no further instructions were coming. The government agencies that were supposed to handle this kind of crisis were dealing with the same problems everyone else was. No power, no communications, no transportation, and temperatures that were dropping by the hour. I tried calling the district office, but the phones were dead. I tried my cell phone, but the towers were either down or overloaded. The internet was completely gone. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely cut off from the corporate structure that had defined my entire existence. No reports to file, no meetings to attend, no emails to answer. Just me, alone in a bank vault, trying to figure out how to survive the end of the world. That's when my military training started to kick in. I'd done 4 years in the Army Reserve right after college, mostly because it helped pay for my business degree. I'd never been deployed overseas, never seen real combat, but I'd been through enough training exercises to understand the basics of survival in hostile environments. Assess your situation, identify your resources, make a plan, adapt as conditions change. The situation was clear enough. A supervolcanic eruption had thrown enough ash and debris into the atmosphere to block out the sun across most of North America. Temperatures were dropping fast, and they were going to keep dropping until the ash settled or was washed out of the atmosphere by weather patterns. That could take months, maybe longer. Crops were going to fail, transportation systems were going to collapse, and most people were going to freeze or starve before the climate returned to normal. My resources were more complicated to assess. I had temporary access to a secure building with some food, water, and power. But more importantly, I had something that nobody else in the city had. I had master key access to every First National Trust location within 200 miles. And I had detailed knowledge of the security systems, vault combinations, and contents of safety deposit boxes at all of those locations. In the old world, that knowledge was just part of my job. In this new world, it might be the difference between life and death. Not just for me, but for anyone smart enough to ally themselves with the guy who held the keys to the kingdom. I started thinking about the other bank locations around the city, 12 branches within the metropolitan area, each with its own vault and hundreds of safety deposit boxes. Rich people don't just keep jewelry and important documents in those boxes. They keep emergency supplies, precious metals, weapons, medication, and other things they think they might need if the normal world stops working properly. I'd approved enough home equity loans to know that wealthy people prepare for disasters differently than everyone else. They have backup plans, multiple residences, offshore accounts, and emergency supplies stored in secure locations. All of that stuff was sitting in vaults around the city, protected by security systems that I could bypass with the right access codes and master keys. But accessing those resources would mean leaving the safety of my current location, traveling through a city full of desperate people, and taking risks that could get me killed. It would also mean making decisions about who to trust, who to help, and who to leave behind. Those weren't the kind of decisions they taught you how to make in business, school. As I sat in my office that second morning, looking out at a frozen wasteland that used to be Columbus, Ohio, I realized that everything I'd learned about risk management was about to be put to the ultimate test. But this wasn't about calculating potential losses on loan portfolios anymore. This was about calculating the odds of staying alive long enough to see if the sun ever came back. I could see other groups of survivors moving through the streets below, and some of them were looking up at the bank building with the kind of interest that made me nervous. Word was going to spread quickly about which buildings had resources and which ones were empty. The bank was obviously a target for anyone smart enough to realize that banks contain more than just money. I needed to make some decisions, and I needed to make them fast. Stay alone and try to wait out the crisis with whatever supplies I could scrounge from the building, or start reaching out to other survivors and try to build some kind of group that could work together to access the resources I knew were available throughout the city. The corporate part of my brain wanted to stay isolated, minimize risk, and avoid the complications that come with managing other people's needs and expectations. But the military part of my brain understood that survival in extreme conditions usually requires teamwork, shared resources, and coordinated planning. I was still weighing these options when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my office. Someone had gotten into the building, and they were coming toward me. My hand went instinctively to the desk drawer where I kept a small handgun that I'd purchased years ago but never seriously thought I'd need to use. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I heard a familiar voice calling my name. It was Patricia, and she sounded scared but not threatening. I opened the door and found her standing there with her teenage son and her elderly father, all of them bundled up in winter coats and looking like refugees from some disaster movie. She started talking as soon as she saw me, words tumbling out. In a rush of relief and desperation, her apartment building had lost power and heat, her car wouldn't start, and the emergency shelters were either full or too dangerous to enter. She'd remembered that I'd stayed at the bank the first night, and she'd walked 12 blocks through the freezing streets to find me. Looking at Patricia and her family standing in that hallway, I realized I was facing the first real decision of my new life. I could turn them away, tell them the bank wasn't safe, that I didn't have enough resources to share. Or I could let them in, accept responsibility for their survival, and start down a path that would change everything about who I was and what I was capable of doing. In that moment, looking at 3 people who were depending on me to make the right choice, I understood that the old world really was gone forever. The man I'd been, the bank manager who scheduled meetings and analyzed risk assessments, he couldn't handle what was coming next. But maybe the man I was becoming could. I stepped aside and let them into the bank. That simple gesture, opening the door for 3 cold and frightened people, was the moment I stopped being Donovan Kellerman, the bank manager, and started becoming Dutch the survivor. I just didn't know it yet. What I did know was that I'd just accepted responsibility for keeping 4 people alive in a world that was trying to kill us all. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already thinking about those 12 other bank locations scattered around the city, and all the resources they contained, and all the other desperate people who were going to be looking for exactly the same things we needed. The game was just beginning, and I was starting to realize that everything I'd learned about managing assets and calculating risk was about to become a matter of life and death. Patricia's arrival changed everything about my situation, but not in the way you might expect. Having 3 more people in the bank didn't just mean I had to share resources. It meant I had to start thinking like a leader instead of just a survivor. And in those first few hours after I let them in, I discovered that 15 years of managing employees had actually prepared me for something I never saw coming. Her son Kevin was 17, one of those kids who spent most of his time on his phone and had never faced any real hardship in his life. Her father Frank was 73, a retired factory worker who'd lived through enough economic downturns to understand that sometimes the world just stops working the way you expect it to. The 3 of them represented everything I was going to have to learn how to manage in this new reality. Hope, fear, experience, and inexperience all mixed together in a package I was suddenly responsible for keeping alive. Patricia had always been efficient in the office, but seeing her in crisis mode made me realize just how valuable her organizational skills were going to be. While I was still trying to figure out how to ration our limited food supplies, she was already taking inventory of everything in the building and creating lists of what we had, what we needed, and how long everything would last if we were careful. "Mr. Kellerman," she said, and I noticed she was still using my formal title even though we were now living in the same building and sharing meals like some kind of corporate family. I've counted everything in the vending machines and the break room. If we're careful, we have enough food for maybe 5 days. Water should last longer, but we need to start thinking about heat and power. Frank was more direct in his assessment. He'd lived through the energy crisis in the 70s, and he understood that when systems fail, they fail completely. The backup generators won't run forever, he told me. And when they stop, this building is going to get cold fast. We need to start thinking about which floors we can actually keep warm. Kevin didn't say much that first day, but I could see him watching me, trying to figure out if I was the kind of person who could actually keep them safe. 17-year-olds have a way of seeing through adult pretenses, and I knew he was measuring me against whatever ideas he had about what leaders should look like in crisis situations. The truth was, I was making it up as I went along, but I'd learned something important during my years in management. Sometimes the most important part of leadership isn't having all the answers. It's making decisions quickly enough to keep moving forward, even when you're not completely sure those decisions are right. We set up sleeping areas on the 3rd floor, which had the best combination of security and access to the building's essential systems. The executive conference room became our main living space, with its large table perfect for meal planning and group discussions. I gave Patricia and her family the adjoining office, while I took the smaller office next door. But the real challenge came that evening when we had our first group meeting around the conference table. I'd called plenty of meetings in my corporate life, but those were about quarterly projections and process improvements. This meeting was about survival, and everyone in the room understood that the decisions we made could determine whether we lived or died. I started by sharing what I knew about our situation. The ash cloud wasn't going to clear anytime soon. Temperatures were continuing to drop, and the radio reports suggested this was happening across the entire continent. Government emergency. Services were overwhelmed or completely non-functional. We were essentially on our own. The way I see it, I told them, we have 2 choices. We can try to wait this out right here with whatever supplies we can find in the building, or we can start thinking about accessing other resources around the city. Frank asked the obvious question. What other resources? That's when I explained about my access to the other bank locations, 12 branches within 50 miles, each with vaults and safety deposit boxes that contained things people had stored for exactly this kind of emergency. Weapons, precious metals, medical supplies, food, and equipment that could make the difference between surviving and dying. Patricia understood immediately. She'd processed enough safety deposit box rentals to know that wealthy people don't just store jewelry and documents. They store the kinds of things they think they'll need if the normal world stops working. But Kevin asked the question that was bothering all of us. Isn't that stealing? It was a fair question, and one I'd been struggling with myself. In the old world, accessing someone else's safety deposit box without permission would have been a serious crime. But in a world where the legal system had collapsed along with everything else, the rules were different. The people who rented those boxes are probably dead, I told him, which was harsh but likely true. And even if they're not coming back for their stuff anytime soon. We can use those resources to stay alive, and when this is over, we can figure out how to make things right. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the kind of practical moral reasoning that survival situations require. Sometimes you have to choose between being completely ethical and being completely dead. Frank had lived through enough hard times to understand this kind of calculation. Dead people don't need emergency supplies, he said simply. Living people do. We spent the rest of that evening planning our first expedition to another bank location. The West Side branch was only 3 miles away, in a neighborhood that had been mostly residential before the eruption. If we could get there safely, access the vault, and get back with supplies, we could prove that my knowledge of the bank system was as valuable as I thought it was. But getting there was going to be the challenge. The streets were blocked with abandoned cars, covered in ash, and potentially dangerous with other groups of survivors, who might not be as friendly as we were. We needed to travel light, move fast, and be prepared for trouble. I decided to take a small team for the first expedition. Myself, because I had the access codes and security knowledge. Patricia, because her organizational skills would be crucial for quickly identifying and cataloging what we found. And Frank, because despite his age, he had the kind of practical experience that might keep us alive if things went wrong. Kevin wanted to come too, but I vetoed that idea immediately. He was too young, too inexperienced, and if something happened to him, I wasn't sure Patricia would be able to function effectively. Better to leave him at the main bank where he'd be relatively safe. That night, as we prepared for our first venture outside the security of our building, I started to understand what military commanders mean when they talk about the weight of responsibility. Every decision I made could get someone killed. Every plan I approved could succeed or fail based on factors I couldn't control or predict. But I also realized something else that surprised me. I was good at this. 15 years of managing people, resources, and complex projects had given me skills that translated directly to managing survival in extreme conditions. Risk assessment, resource allocation, team coordination, contingency planning. All the corporate buzzwords I'd been using for years suddenly had life or death meaning. The next morning, day 4 of our new reality, we prepared for our first expedition to the West Side branch. The temperature outside was -20 degrees, colder than I'd ever experienced in Ohio. The ash was still falling steadily, and visibility was limited to maybe 50 yards in any direction. We dressed in layers, using whatever winter clothing we could find in the lost and found boxes and employee lockers. I carried my handgun, though I'd never fired it outside of a shooting range. Patricia had a small kitchen knife from the break room. Frank carried a heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon if necessary. The plan was simple. Walk to the West Side branch, use my master key and security codes to access the vault and safety deposit boxes, load up with whatever supplies we could carry, and get back to the main bank before dark. Simple plans are usually the best plans, especially when you're dealing with unknown variables and limited experience. But as we stepped outside into the frozen wasteland that used to be Columbus, I realized that nothing about this was going to be simple. The city I'd known for 15 years was gone, replaced by something that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Buildings were barely visible through the ash and snow. Street signs were buried or blown away, and everywhere we looked, there were signs that other people were struggling to survive in the same hostile environment. We saw footprints in the ash, leading in all directions. Some were from individuals, others from groups. Some looked recent, others were already being covered by fresh ashfall. It was like reading a map of desperation, with each set of tracks telling a story about someone's attempt to find safety or supplies in a world that no longer offered either. The walk to the West Side branch took us through residential neighborhoods, where every house was dark and most were already showing signs of damage. Broken windows, doors that had been forced open, cars that had been abandoned when they couldn't make it through the ash-covered streets. It was a landscape of individual tragedies, each one representing a family or a person who'd had their own plans for survival. About halfway to our destination, we encountered our first other survivors, a family of 4, bundled up in blankets, and moving slowly through the ash like refugees from some war zone. The parents looked exhausted and their children were crying from the cold. They saw us coming and immediately moved to the other side of the street, clearly as wary of us as we were of them. Frank wanted to approach them, see if they needed help or had information about conditions in other parts of the city. But I made the decision to keep moving. We had limited resources and a specific mission. Getting involved with other survivors could complicate our plans and put us all at risk. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the moment I started becoming the kind of person who could make the hard choices that survival requires. The old me, the bank manager who worried about customer service and community relationships, might have stopped to help. But the new me understood that helping everyone meant helping no one. We reached the West Side branch just after noon. The building looked intact. From the outside, though, the parking lot was full of abandoned cars and the windows were covered with a thick layer of ash. I used my master key to get us inside, and immediately activated the security system to make sure we'd know if anyone else tried to enter while we were there. The vault access went smoothly. My security code still worked and the electronic systems were still functional thanks to the building's backup power. but what we found inside was better than I'd hoped for. The safety deposit boxes contained exactly the kinds of things I'd expected. Emergency food supplies, water purification tablets, first aid kits, flashlights, batteries, and even some weapons and ammunition. But more importantly, we found evidence that other people had been thinking about exactly the scenarios we were now living through. One box contained detailed maps of the local area with notes about water sources, potential shelter locations, and supply caches. Another contained a comprehensive survival manual with information about everything from water purification to emergency medical procedures. Patricia was in her element, efficiently cataloging everything we found and making quick decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. We could only carry so much, so we focused on the items that would have the biggest impact on our group's survival chances. Frank found something that changed my perspective on our situation. In one of the larger safety deposit boxes, he discovered a battery-powered radio and a list of emergency frequencies. When we tested it, we could hear transmissions from other survivor groups around the region. Not just random distress calls, but organized communications between groups that were clearly working together to coordinate resources and share information. Listening to those radio transmissions, I realized that we weren't the only ones who were thinking strategically about survival. Other groups were forming, territories were being established, and some kind of new social order was already beginning to emerge from the chaos. Some of the transmissions were encouraging, groups offering to trade supplies, share information, or coordinate rescue efforts for stranded survivors. But others were more troubling, references to territories that were off-limits, groups that were taking supplies by force, and areas that were too dangerous for unarmed civilians to enter. One transmission in particular caught my attention, a group that was specifically targeting bank locations, led by someone who seemed to understand that financial institutions would contain valuable resources in a post-apocalyptic scenario. They were systematic, organized, and apparently successful in their operations. That's when I realized that my knowledge of bank locations and security systems wasn't just an advantage, it was also a liability. Other people were going to figure out the same things I'd figured out, and some of them weren't going to be as concerned about moral considerations as I was trying to be. We loaded up with as much as we could carry and started the journey back to our main location. But the return trip was more dangerous than the outbound journey had been. The radio transmissions had made it clear that other groups were active in the area, and some of them were specifically looking for the kinds of resources we were now carrying. About a mile from the main bank, we saw them. A group of 6 or 7 people moving through the streets with the kind of purpose that suggested they weren't just looking for shelter or food. They were organized, they were armed, and they were heading in the same direction we were. I made the decision to take a longer route back to avoid a confrontation. We couldn't afford to lose the supplies we'd gathered, and we didn't know enough about the other group to risk a direct encounter. Better to assume they were hostile and avoid contact entirely. But as we worked our way through side streets and back alleys, I kept thinking about what I'd seen. This wasn't random looting or desperate scavenging. This was organized resource acquisition by people who had a plan and the means to execute it. When we finally made it back to the main bank, I called an immediate group meeting to share what we'd learned. The supplies we'd gathered were important, but the intelligence we'd collected about other survivor groups was even more crucial. Kevin was excited about the food and equipment we'd brought back, but Frank and Patricia understood the bigger picture immediately. We weren't just surviving in isolation anymore. We were part of a larger ecosystem of survivor groups, some friendly, some neutral, and some potentially hostile. "We need to start thinking about defense," Frank said, and I knew he was right. The bank building was secure, but only if we could control access to it. And if other groups were specifically targeting bank locations, it was only a matter of time before they came looking for us. That night, as we inventoried our new supplies and planned our next moves, I found myself thinking about the radio transmissions we'd intercepted. One voice in particular had stood out, someone who seemed to be coordinating multiple groups and making strategic decisions about resource allocation and territorial control. The voice had mentioned something about a bank manager who'd been denying loans to local businesses, someone who'd made enemies before the eruption, and was now sitting on valuable resources that could benefit the community. It took me a few minutes to realize they were talking about me. Ray Hutchinson. I'd denied his business loan application 18 months ago, a decision based on his poor credit history and questionable business plan. He'd taken it personally, made some threats, and generally behaved like the kind of customer who makes banking a sometimes unpleasant profession. But now Ray wasn't just an angry former customer. Based on what I'd heard on the radio, he was leading one of the organized survivor groups in the area, and he clearly hadn't forgotten about our previous encounter. As I settled in for another night in the bank vault, I realized that our situation was more complicated than I'd initially understood. We weren't just trying to survive the environmental disaster. We were also going to have to deal with the human disasters that come when civilization collapses and people start settling old scores. The supplies we'd gathered from the west side branch would help us survive for another week or two. But if Ray's group was actively looking for me, and if they knew about my access to bank resources, then we were going to need more than food and water to stay alive. We were going to need allies, weapons, and a plan for dealing with people who saw us as either a threat or an opportunity. The game was getting more complicated, and the stakes were getting higher with every passing day. The morning of day 5 brought news that changed everything about our situation. Kevin had been monitoring the radio frequencies we'd discovered at the West Side branch, and he'd picked up transmissions that made it clear we were running out of time to make some critical decisions about our future. Ray Hutchinson's group wasn't just randomly scavenging for supplies anymore. They were systematically targeting every First National Trust location in the metropolitan area, and they were doing it with a level of organization that suggested they had inside knowledge about bank operations and security systems. Kevin played back a recording he'd made of one of their transmissions. Ray's voice was unmistakable, even through the static and interference. He was coordinating with at least 3 other teams, giving them specific instructions about vault access procedures and safety deposit box locations. Someone in his group clearly understood bank security systems almost as well as I did. But the transmission that really got my attention was the one where Ray mentioned me by name. He told his teams to be on the lookout for Donovan Kellerman, described my appearance in detail, and made it clear that finding me was a high priority for his operation. He knew I had master access to all the bank locations, and he wanted that access for himself. "He's got a personal grudge against you," Patricia said after we'd listened to the recordings. "This isn't just about resources anymore. This is about revenge." She was right, but that wasn't the part that worried me most. What worried me was that Ray's group was moving faster and more efficiently than I'd expected. They'd already hit 4 bank locations in the past 2 days, and they were getting better at it with each operation. Frank had been studying the maps we'd found at the West Side branch, and he'd identified a pattern in Ray's movements. They're working their way systematically through the suburbs, then moving toward downtown. At their current pace, they'll be here within 48 hours. That gave us 2 choices. We could try to fortify our current location and hope we could outlast a siege, or we could abandon the main bank and try to stay ahead of Ray's group while accessing the remaining vault locations ourselves. I called a group meeting that morning to discuss our options. The 4 of us sat around the conference table where I'd once discussed quarterly earnings reports, but now we were discussing matters of life and death. "If we stay here, we're trapped," I told them. "Ray knows this building, he knows I'm here, and he's got the manpower to either wait us out or force his way in. But if we leave, we give up the security and resources we've built up here." Kevin surprised me by asking the most strategic question. "What about the other banks? If his group is hitting them systematically, are we just going to let them take everything?" It was a good point. My knowledge of vault locations and security systems was only valuable if I could actually access those vaults before someone else got to them. Every day we waited was another day for Ray's teams to strip resources that could be crucial for our survival. Patricia had been thinking along the same lines. "We could split up," she suggested. "Some of us could stay here and maintain our base while others go out and gather supplies from the remaining locations." But Frank shook his head. "Splitting up makes us vulnerable. If something happens to one group, the others might never know about it. We need to stick together." I realized that this was one of those leadership moments where I had to make a decision that everyone might not agree with, but that someone had to make for the good of the group. We couldn't afford to debate options forever while Ray's team systematically eliminated our advantages. We're going mobile, I decided. We'll take what we can carry from here, hit as many of the remaining bank locations as possible, and stay ahead of Ray's operation. Once we've gathered enough resources, we'll find a more defensible location to establish a permanent base. It was a risky plan, but it played to our strengths. We were smaller and more mobile than Ray's group, and I had better knowledge of the bank locations and security systems. If we moved fast and stayed smart, we could access resources that would give us long-term advantages over larger but less organized groups. We spent the rest of day 5 preparing for our departure. Patricia organized our supplies into portable packs. Frank studied the maps to plan our route between bank locations, and Kevin monitored the radio to track Ray's movements. I used my access to download security information and vault access codes onto a portable device that would let us operate independently of the main computer systems. But as we prepared to leave the building that had been our home for almost a week, I found myself thinking about what we were becoming. We'd started as survivors trying to wait out a disaster. Now we were becoming something more organized, more aggressive, more willing to take risks to gain advantages over other groups. That evening, we made our first major expedition as a mobile team. Our target was the Northside branch, which according to my records had the largest concentration of safety deposit boxes in the system. If we were going to load up with resources, that was the place to do it. The journey to the Northside branch was different from our previous expedition. We weren't just 3 people carrying basic supplies anymore. We were a coordinated team with specific roles and a clear mission. Frank handled navigation and security. Patricia managed logistics and inventory. Kevin monitored communications, and I handled all the technical aspects of vault access. The Northside branch was in a commercial district that had been hit harder by looting than the residential areas we'd explored before. Most of the storefronts had broken windows, and there were signs that multiple groups had been through the area looking for supplies. But the bank building itself was intact, and my security access worked perfectly. Within 30 minutes, we had the vault open, and were systematically going through safety deposit boxes with the efficiency of a professional operation. What we found exceeded my expectations. The Northside clientele had been particularly security conscious, and their emergency preparations reflected that mindset. We found military-grade equipment, advanced medical supplies, communication devices, and enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small militia. But we also found something that changed my understanding of our situation. In one of the larger safety deposit boxes, we discovered detailed intelligence reports about local government emergency planning and resource distribution. Someone had been paying attention to official disaster preparedness protocols and had compiled information about government supply caches, emergency communication networks, and evacuation procedures. The documents revealed that there were federal emergency supply depots located throughout the region, stocked with enough food, water, and medical supplies to support thousands of people for months. But more importantly, they contained maps showing the locations of these facilities and the access codes needed to open them. Patricia understood the implications immediately. "This isn't just about bank vaults anymore," she said. "If these government facilities are real, and if we can access them, we're talking about resources that could support a much larger group of survivors." Frank was more cautious. Government facilities are going to be defended either by official personnel or by groups that have already taken them over. This could be more dangerous than anything we've attempted so far. But Kevin raised the question that was bothering all of us. What if Ray's group gets this information? If they find these documents, they'll have access to resources that could make them unstoppable. That's when I realized we'd reached another decision point. We could continue our current strategy of staying mobile and accessing bank resources ahead of Ray's teams, or we could use this new intelligence to attempt something much more ambitious and potentially much more dangerous. As we loaded up with supplies from the Northside branch, I made the decision that would define everything that happened next. We weren't just going to try to stay ahead of Ray's group anymore. We were going to use our advantages to access resources that would let us establish ourselves as a major power in the post-apocalyptic landscape that was emerging around us. But first, We needed to gather intelligence about what other groups were operating in the area, what resources they'd already secured, and what their intentions were regarding territorial control and resource sharing. On the way back from the Northside branch, we encountered our first direct contact with another organized survivor group. They weren't Ray's people, but they were clearly experienced and well-equipped. 6 individuals, moving with military precision, carrying professional-grade weapons and communication equipment. Their leader approached us while his team maintained defensive positions. He was polite but direct, asking about our group's size, intentions, and resource situation. It was the kind of conversation that could either lead to cooperation or conflict, depending on how we handled it. I made the decision to be partially honest. I told him we were a small group of bank employees who'd been using our building access to gather supplies. I didn't mention the government intelligence we'd discovered, or my broader knowledge of vault locations throughout the region. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, a former National Guard sergeant who was leading a group of 23 survivors, based in an abandoned shopping mall about 10 miles south of our location. His group was focused on establishing a secure perimeter and gathering resources through organized expeditions, much like what we were doing. We're always interested in cooperation with other organized groups, he told me. Resource sharing, information exchange, mutual defense agreements. The scattered groups don't last long out here. Organization is what separates the survivors from the casualties. It was exactly the kind of alliance that could benefit us in the long term. Marcus's group had manpower and military experience. We had specialized knowledge and access to resources they couldn't easily obtain on their own. But as we talked, I became aware that we were being watched by another group. Frank spotted them first, positioned on rooftops about 2 blocks away with what looked like sniper rifles or other long-range weapons. They weren't making any aggressive moves, but their presence suggested that this area was more contested than it appeared. Marcus noticed my distraction and followed my gaze to the rooftop positions. Ray Hutchinson's scouts, he said with obvious distaste. They've been expanding their territory aggressively, already absorbed 3 smaller groups either through intimidation or force. That confirmed what I'd suspected about Ray's operation. He wasn't just gathering resources. He was building an organization capable of controlling territory and dominating other survivor groups. How much do you know about Hutchinson's capabilities? I asked, trying to sound casual while gathering intelligence that could save our lives. Marcus was happy to share what he knew. Ray's group had grown to over 40 people with a core leadership team that had military and law enforcement backgrounds. They'd established a base in a former National Guard armory, giving them access to vehicles, weapons, and communications equipment that most civilian groups couldn't match. But more troubling was their approach to other survivor groups. They'd made offers of protection and resource sharing to smaller groups, but the terms were essentially surrender. Join Ray's organization under his leadership, or be treated as competitors for limited resources. They made us the same offer 2 days ago, Marcus said. We declined. Since then, they've been probing our defenses and intercepting our supply expeditions. It's only a matter of time before they try to force the issue. That's when I understood that our situation was more complicated than just avoiding Ray's personal vendetta against me. We were caught in the middle of a larger conflict between organized groups that were competing for control of resources and territory throughout the region. Marcus's group represented one model of post-apocalyptic organization: democratic leadership, voluntary cooperation, resource sharing based on contribution and need. Ray's group represented a different model: hierarchical command structure, territorial, control through force, resource allocation based on power and loyalty. The choice between these models wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about what kind of society would emerge from the collapse of the old world. As we concluded our conversation with Marcus and prepared to return to our temporary base, I realized that the intelligence we'd discovered about government supply depots could be the deciding factor in this emerging conflict. Whichever group gained access to those resources first would have a decisive advantage over all the others. But accessing those facilities would require more than just security codes and maps. It would require manpower, firepower, and the kind of organized operation that neither our small group nor Marcus's larger group could manage independently. That night, As we settled into a temporary shelter in an abandoned office building, I presented our options to the group. We could continue our current strategy of mobile resource gathering, staying small and independent, but vulnerable to larger, organized groups. We could join forces with Marcus's group, gaining security and manpower but losing our independence and specialized advantages. Or we could attempt to access the government supply depots ourselves, using the intelligence we'd discovered to gain resources that would make us a major power in the region. Frank was skeptical about the third option. 4 people can't take on a government facility, even if it's abandoned. And if it's not abandoned, we could be walking into a situation we can't handle. But Patricia had been thinking about the bigger picture. What if we don't try to take the facilities by force? What if we use our intelligence to broker deals between different survivor groups? Information in exchange for protection, resource sharing, alliance agreements. Kevin surprised us all by suggesting the most ambitious plan. What if we use what we know to bring the groups together? Marcus's people, some of the other organized groups, maybe even some of Ray's people who might not be happy with his leadership style. Pool our resources and knowledge to access the government facilities as a coalition. It was a risky strategy, but it addressed the fundamental problem we were facing. As long as the organized groups in the region were competing against each other, the strongest and most ruthless group would eventually dominate all the others. But if we could create a coalition based on shared interests and mutual benefit, we might be able to establish something better than survival of the fittest. As I considered our options, I realized that the next decision I made would determine not just our group's survival, but our role in whatever kind of society emerged. From the ashes of the old world, the radio reports we'd been monitoring suggested that similar conflicts were playing out in other regions, with organized groups fighting for control of resources and territory, while unorganized survivors struggled to stay alive caught between them. We had an opportunity to influence the outcome of this process, but only if we were willing to take risks that could either establish us as major players or get us all killed in the attempt. The sun was setting on day 5, and I knew that by morning I would have to choose a path that there would be no going back from. Day 6 began with a decision that would either save us all or get us killed. I'd spent most of the night thinking about our conversation with Marcus Webb and weighing our options against the intelligence we'd gathered about government supply depots. By morning, I knew what we had to do, even though it meant taking risks that my old corporate mindset would have considered completely unacceptable. I called our group together for what I knew would be the most important meeting we'd ever had. Patricia, Frank, and Kevin gathered around the small table in our temporary shelter, and I could see in their faces that they understood this wasn't going to be another routine planning session. We're going to contact Marcus Webb's group and propose a joint operation, I told them. We'll share the government facility intelligence in exchange for manpower and military expertise. Together, we can access resources that neither group could secure independently. Frank was immediately skeptical. That's assuming Webb's people can be trusted. We barely know them, and once we share that intelligence, we lose our biggest advantage. But Patricia understood the strategic thinking behind my decision. We can't access those facilities with just 4 people, she said. And if we don't move soon, Ray's group might discover the same intelligence through their own operations. Kevin had been monitoring radio traffic all morning, and he'd picked up transmissions that made our timeline even more urgent. Ray's teams hit 2 more bank locations yesterday, he reported. They're moving faster than we anticipated, and they're getting more systematic about searching safety deposit boxes. That confirmed what I'd suspected. Ray wasn't just looking for basic supplies anymore. He was conducting intelligence-gathering operations, searching for exactly the kind of information we'd discovered at the Northside branch. I made the decision to contact Marcus immediately. We used the radio, frequencies we'd established during our previous encounter, and within an hour we'd arranged a meeting at a neutral location, halfway between our temporary shelter and his group's base. The meeting took place in an abandoned restaurant that gave both groups clear sightlines and multiple escape routes. Marcus brought 2 of his people, while I brought Frank for his practical experience and Kevin for his technical skills with the radio equipment. I decided to be direct about what we were offering, I showed Marcus the government facility documents we'd discovered, explained their significance, and outlined what a joint operation might accomplish. Marcus studied the documents carefully, and I could see him calculating the risks and benefits in his head. These facilities could change everything, he said finally. But they're going to be heavily defended, either by federal personnel or by groups that have already taken them over. Frank raised the obvious concern. What's to stop your people from taking this information and cutting us out of the operation? It was a fair question, and Marcus's answer revealed something important about his leadership philosophy. Because we're not Ray Hutchinson, he said simply. We believe in cooperation and mutual benefit. Besides, you people have knowledge and skills we need. This works better as a partnership than as a takeover. That's when I realized Marcus and I shared similar views about how organized groups should operate in the post-apocalyptic world. Neither of us was interested in building a dictatorship based on force and intimidation. We both understood that sustainable survival required cooperation, specialization, and shared leadership. We spent the next 2 hours planning a joint reconnaissance mission to the nearest government facility. According to the documents, it was located in an underground complex about 20 miles northeast of Columbus, designed to supply emergency resources for up to 5,000 people for 6 months. The facility was heavily fortified, but the access codes we'd discovered should allow us to enter without having to break down barriers or fight through defensive positions. The real unknown was whether the facility was currently occupied, and if so, by whom. Marcus assigned 6 of his most experienced people to the mission, including himself and a former Army medic who could assess any medical supplies we might find. I would lead our group of 4, bringing my knowledge of security systems and access procedures. But as we finalized our plans, Kevin intercepted a radio transmission that changed everything about our timeline. Ray's group had discovered our temporary shelter location and was organizing a search operation that would reach our area within hours. We need to move immediately, I told Marcus. If Ray's people find us before we complete this operation, we'll lose our opportunity to access the government facility. Marcus understood the urgency. His group was also being pressured by Ray's expanding territorial control, and he knew that acquiring the government resources could shift the balance of power in the region. We agreed to proceed with the mission immediately, despite not having completed all our preparation. Sometimes in crisis situations, perfect planning is less important than quick execution. The combined group of 10 people moved out toward the government facility location within an hour of our meeting. Marcus's people provided security and military expertise, while my group handled navigation and technical aspects of facility access. The journey to the facility was more dangerous than our previous expeditions. We were moving through territory that multiple groups were actively contesting, and our larger size made us more visible to potential threats. About halfway to our destination, we encountered clear evidence that we weren't the only ones who knew about the government facilities. We found the remains of a camp where another group had clearly been studying the same documents we had. Maps, notes, and equipment fragments suggested they'd been planning a similar operation. Frank discovered something that made our situation much more urgent. Among the abandoned materials, he found radio communication logs that showed this group had been in contact with Ray Hutchinson's organization. They'd been sharing intelligence about government facility locations in exchange for protection and resource-sharing agreements. Ray already knows about these facilities, I told Marcus. If this group was working with him, he's probably planning his own operation to access them. Marcus studied the communication logs and reached the same conclusion I had. We're not just racing against time anymore, he said. We're racing against a competing operation that has more manpower and better equipment than we do. That's when I made the decision that defined everything that happened next. Instead of proceeding cautiously with our reconnaissance mission, we were going to attempt to access the facility immediately and secure as many resources as possible before Ray's teams could mount their own operation. It was a risky change of plans, but it was the kind of calculated risk that survival situations sometimes require. The potential benefits of gaining access to government emergency supplies outweighed the dangers of rushing an operation. we hadn't fully prepared for. The government facility was located in a forested area that had provided good camouflage before the ashfall, but now looked like a gray wasteland dotted with dead trees. The entrance was concealed in what appeared to be a maintenance building, but the security systems were obviously much more sophisticated than the simple exterior suggested. My access codes worked perfectly, which confirmed that the facility had been abandoned by official personnel when the crisis began. But as we descended into the underground complex, it became clear that we weren't the first people to discover this location. There were signs of recent habitation in the facility's main corridors: sleeping areas, cooking equipment, and personal belongings suggested that someone had been using the complex as a base of operations. But whoever had been there was gone now, leaving behind evidence of a group that had been larger and better organized than either of our teams. Marcus deployed his people to secure the facility while Patricia and I worked on accessing the main supply areas. The storage rooms contained everything the documents had promised: medical supplies, food, water, communications equipment, weapons, and other resources that could support a large group for months. But Kevin made a discovery that explained why the facility had been abandoned by its previous occupants. The facility's internal communication system was still active, and he'd managed to access message logs that showed the previous group had been in contact with federal emergency coordinators who were still operational in other regions. The messages revealed that organized military units were beginning to reassert federal authority in some areas, establishing controlled zones and resource distribution networks. Groups that could demonstrate legitimate need and peaceful intentions were being integrated into these emerging federal operations. But groups that had engaged in aggressive resource acquisition or territorial control were being treated as hostile forces to be contained or eliminated. This information changed the entire strategic picture. We weren't just competing with other survivor groups for limited resources anymore. We were operating in an environment where federal authority was beginning to return, and our actions over the next few days could determine whether we were classified as legitimate survivors or as threats to restored order. Marcus understood the implications immediately. If federal forces are reasserting control, we need to position ourselves as cooperative groups that can work within their framework, he said. The kind of territorial expansion Ray's group has been pursuing could make them targets for military intervention. As we loaded supplies from the government facility, I realized that our operation had revealed intelligence that was more valuable than the physical resources we were acquiring. Knowledge about federal recovery operations, communication, frequencies for legitimate authorities, and criteria for distinguishing between cooperative and hostile survivor groups. But our success at the facility was interrupted by radio contact from the lookouts Marcus had positioned around the perimeter. Ray's convoy was approaching the facility location, and they were bringing enough people and equipment to mount a serious assault on our position. "How long before they reach us?" Marcus asked his team over the radio. 20 minutes, maybe less," came the reply. 3 vehicles, looks like 15 to 20 people, and they're armed for serious combat. I found myself facing the kind of decision that I'd never imagined having to make when I was reviewing loan applications and managing quarterly reports. We could try to complete our resource gathering and escape before Ray's group arrived. We could prepare to defend the facility and fight for control of the resources, or we could attempt to negotiate some kind of arrangement that avoided direct conflict. Marcus was clearly thinking along military lines. "This facility is defensible," he said. "If we can control the access points, we can hold off a larger force indefinitely." But Frank raised the concern that was bothering me most. If we get into a firefight with Ray's people, we're not just fighting for resources anymore. We're starting a war that could involve other groups throughout the region. Patricia had been thinking about the federal intelligence we'd discovered. What if we use what we know about federal operations to change the dynamic? If legitimate authorities are returning, maybe we can contact them directly. Kevin had been monitoring the facility's communication systems, and he'd managed to establish contact with one of the federal coordination centers mentioned in the message logs. "I've got someone on the line," he reported. "Military emergency. Coordination, and they're asking about our status and intentions." That's when I realized we had an opportunity to change the entire situation. Instead of fighting Ray's group for control of the facility, We could bring federal authorities into the conflict and let them establish legitimate control over the resources. I took the radio from Kevin and identified myself to the federal coordinator. I explained our situation honestly. Small survivor groups accessing emergency supplies in accordance with federal disaster protocols, threatened by a larger hostile group that had been engaging in aggressive territorial expansion. The federal response was immediate and decisive. Military units were already being deployed to secure government emergency facilities throughout the region. Our report of hostile groups attempting to seize federal resources would be treated as a priority situation requiring immediate intervention. Maintain your position and avoid engagement if possible, the coordinator told me. Federal response. Teams are en route to your location and will arrive within 2 hours. I shared this information with Marcus, and we quickly coordinated a new plan. Instead of preparing to fight Ray's group, we would withdraw from the facility and maintain surveillance until federal forces arrived to take control of the situation. It was a strategy that turned our disadvantage in numbers and firepower into an advantage in legitimacy and official support. Ray's group might be able to overwhelm our combined teams, but they weren't going to be able to fight federal military units. As we evacuated the facility with the supplies we'd already gathered, I realized that Day 6 had fundamentally changed our situation. We were no longer just survivor groups competing for resources in a lawless environment. We were part of a larger process of restoring legitimate authority and rebuilding organized society. But that also meant we were going to be judged by different standards. Our actions over the past 6 days would be evaluated by federal authorities who were distinguishing between groups that could be integrated into restored order and groups that represented ongoing threats to stability. Ray Hutchinson's convoy arrived at the facility location just as we reached our withdrawal positions. I watched through binoculars as his teams deployed around the facility entrance, clearly preparing for the kind of assault operation they'd use to take control of other locations. But they were walking into a situation that was completely different from anything they'd encountered before. Federal forces were already en route, and Ray's group was about to discover that the rules of post-apocalyptic survival had suddenly changed. The morning of Day 6 had begun with a risky decision to trust another survivor group and attempt a joint operation. It was ending with federal authorities returning to assert control over the situation, and our small group positioned as legitimate survivors rather than lawless raiders. But I knew that the real test was still coming. When federal forces arrived and began evaluating different survivor groups, we would have to prove that we deserved to be treated as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The federal forces arrived exactly when they said they would, and what happened next taught me more about leadership, survival, and human nature than 15 years of corporate management ever could. From our observation position half a mile from the government facility, we watched 3 military vehicles approach Ray Hutchinson's convoy, with the kind of precision that only comes from professional training and clear command authority. Ray's people had been attempting to breach the facility entrance for over an hour when the federal units arrived. I could see through binoculars that they'd brought cutting equipment and explosives, clearly planning to force their way into the complex, regardless of what security systems were in place. The military response was swift and professional. The federal commander used loudspeakers to identify his unit and order Ray's group to withdraw from the facility immediately. When Ray's people didn't comply within the specified time frame, the federal forces deployed in positions that made it clear they were prepared to use whatever force was necessary to secure the location. Marcus had been monitoring federal communication frequencies, and he was able to relay what was happening in real time. Ray's trying to negotiate, he reported. Claims his group has legitimate salvage rights to abandoned government property. But the federal commander wasn't interested in negotiation. The facility contained emergency supplies that were part of a coordinated federal recovery operation, and any unauthorized access would be treated as theft of government resources during a declared emergency. Kevin had maintained radio contact with the Federal Coordination Center, and they'd requested detailed information about our group's activities and intentions. I provided a complete report of our operations over the past 6 days, including our resource gathering from bank locations, our cooperation with Marcus's group, and our discovery of the government facility intelligence. The federal response revealed how dramatically the situation had changed since the initial crisis. Military units were systematically securing emergency supply facilities throughout the region, establishing communication networks with legitimate survivor groups, and beginning to provide organized assistance to civilians who could demonstrate peaceful intentions and community cooperation. But they were also identifying and containing groups that had engaged in aggressive territorial expansion, forced resource acquisition, or other activities that threatened the restoration of civil order. Ray's group clearly fell into the second category. Their systematic targeting of bank locations, their use of intimidation and force against other survivor groups, and their current attempt to seize federal emergency supplies marked them as a threat rather than as legitimate survivors. From our observation position, we watched the standoff develop between Ray's convoy and the federal forces. Ray had superior numbers, but the military units had better training, better equipment, and the authority to call for additional support if needed. The confrontation lasted almost 2 hours before Ray made the decision to withdraw his people from the facility. But even as his convoy pulled back, I could see that this wasn't a surrender. It was a tactical retreat by someone who was calculating his next move against a new type of opponent. Marcus understood the strategic implications immediately. Ray's not going to give up his territorial control just because federal forces are returning, he said. He's going to adapt his operations to avoid direct confrontation while maintaining his resource base. That meant our situation was actually more dangerous now than it had been before federal intervention. Ray's group was still operating in Mir, the region, still pursuing their aggressive expansion strategy, but now they were going to be more careful about avoiding federal attention. The federal commander requested a face-to-face meeting with representatives from our combined group. Marcus and I were designated to speak for both teams, and we approached the military position under a flag of truce that the commander had authorized. Colonel James Mitchell was exactly the kind of professional military officer you'd expect to be leading federal recovery operations. Direct, efficient, and focused on gathering accurate information to support strategic decision-making. He questioned us extensively about our group compositions, our resource acquisition activities, and our knowledge of other survivor groups in the region. I made the decision to be completely honest about our operations, including our access to bank vaults and safety deposit boxes. Colonel Mitchell's response revealed that federal authorities were already aware of these activities and had developed policies for dealing with civilian resource acquisition during emergency conditions. Accessing abandoned resources for survival purposes is understandable and generally acceptable, he told us. But systematic looting operations and territorial control through force are not. We need to distinguish between legitimate survivors and opportunistic raiders. He explained that federal recovery operations were focusing on 3 priorities: securing government emergency supplies for coordinated distribution, establishing communication networks with legitimate survivor groups, and containing or eliminating hostile groups that threatened civil order. Our combined group fell clearly into the legitimate survivor category. We'd demonstrated cooperation between different teams, we'd avoided aggressive confrontations with other groups when possible, and we'd provided valuable intelligence about both resources and threats in the region. Ray's group represented the kind of threat that federal forces were specifically designed to address. Their expansion through intimidation, their systematic resource acquisition, and their attempted seizure of government supplies marked them as a priority target for containment operations. Colonel Mitchell offered our groups a choice that would determine our role in whatever came next. We could be integrated into the Federal Coordination Network, receiving official support and protection in exchange for providing intelligence and assistance with recovery operations. Or we could maintain our independence, accepting responsibility for our own security and resource acquisition without federal support. Marcus and I requested time to discuss this decision with our respective teams. It was the kind of choice that would define not just our survival, but our role in the emerging post-crisis society. We withdrew to our observation positions to hold separate group meetings about the federal offer. Patricia, Frank, and Kevin gathered around me to discuss what integration into federal operations would mean for our independence and our future plans. Frank was skeptical about federal promises. Government assistance always comes with strings attached, he said. Once we're part of their system, we lose control over our own decisions. But Patricia understood the practical advantages. We can't compete with military resources and organization, she pointed out. If federal authority is returning, we need to position ourselves as part of the solution rather than as an ongoing problem. Kevin raised the question that was central to our decision. What happens to groups like Ray's if they don't accept federal authority? Are we talking about negotiation, containment, or elimination? I realized that this was the moment when I had to decide what kind of leader I was going to be in the world that was emerging from the crisis. The old corporate me would have focused on risk management and self-preservation. But the person I'd become over the past 6 days understood that leadership sometimes requires accepting responsibility for outcomes that extend beyond your immediate group. We're going to accept federal integration, I told my team, not just for our own security, but because it's the right thing to do for the larger community of survivors. Marcus reached the same conclusion with his group, and we returned to Colonel Mitchell with our acceptance of federal coordination. The integration process was more comprehensive than I'd expected, involving detailed debriefings about our knowledge of regional resources and threats, coordination protocols for future operations, and assignment of specific roles within the broader recovery effort. But it also provided immediate benefits that confirmed we'd made the right decision. Official identification as legitimate survivors under federal protection, access to communication networks that connected us with other authorized groups throughout the region, and intelligence about federal recovery operations that were expanding daily. More importantly, we received specific intelligence about Ray Hutchinson's operations that revealed how serious the threat had become. His group had grown to over 60 people through forced absorption of smaller groups, established multiple bases throughout the region, and begun systematic raids against both survivor groups and federal supply operations. Federal forces were treating Ray's organization as an insurgent group that required military containment rather than civilian law enforcement. Plans were already in development for coordinated operations to neutralize his territorial control and rescue civilians who were being held under his authority against their will. Colonel Mitchell assigned our combined group specific roles in these upcoming operations. Our knowledge of bank locations and security systems could help federal forces identify resources that Ray's group might target. Our experience with survivor group communications could help identify and contact other legitimate groups that needed federal protection. But our most important contribution would be intelligence about Ray's personal motivations and decision-making patterns. My history with Ray gave me insights into his psychology that could be crucial for predicting his responses to federal pressure. As Day 6 turned into Day 7, I found myself in a position I never could have imagined when I was sitting in my corporate office reviewing loan applications. I was serving as an intelligence advisor to federal military operations, helping to plan strategies for dealing with post-apocalyptic insurgency groups. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ray Hutchinson's loan application had been denied because of poor credit history and questionable business planning. Now those same character flaws were manifesting as leadership failures that threatened the security of everyone in the region. Day 7 began with news that changed the entire strategic situation. Federal reconnaissance had located Ray's main base of operations and confirmed that he was holding at least 30 civilians who were being forced to support his resource acquisition operations under threat of expulsion into the frozen wasteland. This discovery transformed the situation from a resource competition between survivor groups into a hostage rescue operation that required immediate federal intervention. Colonel Mitchell requested detailed intelligence about Ray's leadership structure, security procedures, and likely responses to military pressure. I provided everything I knew about Ray's psychology and behavioral patterns: his tendency to escalate conflicts when challenged, his willingness to use intimidation and threats to maintain control, and his personal grudge against anyone who had opposed him before the crisis. But I also shared my assessment that Ray's group contained people who were only following him out of desperation rather than loyalty. If federal forces could demonstrate that they offered a better alternative for survival and security, many of Ray's followers might be willing to abandon his organization. The federal operation against Ray's main base was planned as a coordinated assault that would minimize casualties while maximizing the chances of successful civilian rescue. Multiple approach routes, simultaneous pressure from different directions, and psychological warfare designed to encourage defections from Ray's organization. Our combined group was assigned support roles that kept us away from direct combat, but allowed us to contribute to the operation's success. We would maintain communication with other survivor groups in the area, provide real-time intelligence about Ray's potential escape routes, and assist with processing civilians who were rescued from his control. But as federal forces prepared for the assault, Kevin intercepted radio transmissions that revealed Ray had discovered federal plans and was preparing his own response. Instead of waiting for the military attack, he was planning to abandon his main base and scatter his forces into smaller groups that would be harder to track and eliminate. This information forced Colonel Mitchell to accelerate the timeline for the assault operation. Instead of the careful preparation he'd planned, federal forces would have to move immediately to prevent Ray's escape and rescue the civilians before they could be relocated to more secure positions. The assault on Ray's main base began just after dawn on day 7. From our communication position several miles away, we monitored federal radio traffic as military units moved into position around the converted warehouse complex that Ray had fortified as his headquarters. The initial phases of the operation proceeded according to plan. Federal forces secured the perimeter, established communication with civilians inside the complex, and began psychological operations designed to encourage surrender rather than resistance. But Ray's response was more aggressive than anyone had anticipated. Instead of attempting to escape or negotiate, he ordered his core followers to prepare for a siege that he claimed would demonstrate that federal authority was too weak to establish real control over the region. The confrontation that followed lasted most of day 7 and involved combat between federal forces and Ray's organization that was unlike anything the region had experienced since the initial crisis. It wasn't random violence or desperate scavenging. It was organized military conflict between competing authorities for control of territory and population. Marcus and I monitored the situation through federal communication networks, providing intelligence and analysis that helped military commanders understand Ray's tactical decisions and predict his next moves. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Ray's group had grown larger through intimidation and forced recruitment, but they lacked the training, equipment, and coordination that professional military units possessed. More importantly, many of Ray's followers began surrendering or defecting as soon as federal forces demonstrated that they could provide security and protection. The siege ended when Ray himself was killed during an attempt to break through federal lines with his remaining core followers. The man who had threatened me over a denied loan application, who had built a post-apocalyptic empire through force and intimidation, died trying to maintain control over people who no longer wanted to follow him. With Ray's organization eliminated, federal forces were able to rescue all 30 civilians who had been held at the complex. Most of them were integrated into legitimate survivor groups that were cooperating with federal recovery operations. Some chose to join our combined group, bringing our total membership to over 50 people. The success of the federal operation against Ray's organization sent a clear message to other groups throughout the region. Cooperation with legitimate authority would be rewarded with protection and resources. Resistance to federal recovery efforts would be met with overwhelming force. Within days of Ray's elimination, most of the remaining independent groups in the region had requested integration into federal coordination networks. The period of lawless competition for resources was ending, replaced by organized recovery operations that prioritized civilian safety and community rebuilding. As day 7 concluded, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed since that Tuesday morning when Yellowstone erupted and turned my corporate world upside down. The man who had spent his career managing other people's money had become someone who managed other people's lives in situations where every decision could mean the difference between survival and death. But more importantly, I'd learned that the skills I'd developed in corporate management were directly applicable to crisis leadership, risk assessment, resource allocation, team coordination, strategic planning. All the business principles I'd used to manage quarterly earnings could be adapted to manage survival in extreme conditions. The federal coordinator who debriefed our group after Ray's elimination made an offer that represented everything our situation had become. Federal recovery operations needed people with leadership experience, resource management skills, and detailed knowledge of regional infrastructure. I could continue leading our survivor group under federal coordination, eventually transitioning into a role with the civilian government that would be reestablished as conditions stabilized. Or, I could accept assignment to federal emergency management operations in other regions, where organized recovery efforts were just beginning. It was the kind of career opportunity that the old me would have analyzed in terms of salary, benefits, and advancement potential. But the person I'd become understood that some decisions are about more than personal advantage. I chose to stay with our group and help establish the civilian infrastructure that would be needed for long-term recovery in our region. Not because it offered the best personal opportunities, but because it was where I could do the most good for the people who had trusted me to lead them through the worst crisis of their lives. Patricia became our group's coordinator with federal operations, using her organizational skills to manage resource distribution and communication with other survivor communities. Frank took responsibility for security and practical infrastructure development. Kevin became our technology specialist, maintaining communication networks and information systems. Together we began the process of rebuilding not just our physical infrastructure, but the social and economic systems that make civilization possible. It was work that would take years, maybe decades, but it was work that felt meaningful in ways that quarterly earnings reports never had. Looking back now at those first 7 days when the world ended and began again, I understand that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about deciding what kind of person you're going to be when everything you thought you knew about life stops working. I went from being a bank manager who worried about loan default rates to being a leader who helped establish the foundation for rebuilding civilization after its collapse. The skills transferred, but the responsibility was completely different. If you're watching this because you're facing your own crisis, remember that your current knowledge and experience aren't useless just because the world has changed. You just need to figure out how to apply what you know to whatever situation you're actually facing. And remember that survival is almost always a team effort. The people who try to go it alone usually don't make it. The people who build cooperation and trust with others, who share resources and responsibility, who think beyond their own immediate needs, those are the people who not only survive but help create something better than what existed before. The first week of the Ice Age apocalypse taught me that crisis doesn't just reveal who you really are. It gives you the opportunity to become who you're capable of being when the stakes are high enough and the need is great enough.